Hello and welcome. I'm your host, William Lou. You're listening to the Hello and Welcome podcast presented by Betway. Make sure you follow the Hello and Welcome podcast wherever you listen to the show. Please continue to rate, review, subscribe to our programming. Back for the season. That means 3 episodes per week with the weekly show and also every post-game show. We will be here, and honestly we'll probably be live more often than not, and the best way to catch all our content is to hit subscribe, is to hit the notification bell, and that way you won't miss out on all this glorious Raptors content. For today, we are gonna go solo on this one because producer Alex is celebrating his 40th birthday once again. Somehow he is going to New York. He's going to be there with friend of the program, Ennis Esmer. Please catch Children Ruin Everything wherever you watch your daytime television. But my idea for this, and decided not to get a guest because I just wanted to break this thing down myself, is to just build the Raptors rotation for this upcoming season. And because for me, I think largely speaking, the starting 5, there's only really one question left in there. But then again, the Raptors do have a lot of new faces with the second unit, and I do wonder sort of how it's all going to break down. And specifically, what the rotation will look like just for this upcoming season. So that's something that I actually went down to practice this week to ask Darko about. And I asked him about sort of what he wants out of that 5th starter position. So we'll start there. Let's hear from Darko first and foremost.
Nothing is cemented. Every player, every single day. This is sport. This is basketball. You need to compete every single day. What happened yesterday, that's history. What's coming tomorrow, we don't know. All we have is today. And I want all of our guys to have that approach, really to push themselves to get better every single day. So our team, some guys, they might start one game, they might not start the next game, and that doesn't have anything to do with punishment or reward. It's just like finding what works best for our team and to get our guys to grow day in and day out.
So I found the answer from Darko a little bit interesting because of the fact that, maybe it's just my own assumption, but it does seem like 4 spots are certainly solidified. Jakob at center, Scottie at power forward, RJ at the 2, and or 3, I guess, and then Emmanuel quickly at the 1. Now, of course, I do admire, and I guess I agree with Darko's overall position that everybody should really approach it like nothing is guaranteed and try to fight for these spots. But at the same time, let's be honest, these are the 4 highest paid players on the team, and they are the 4 best players at their positions on the team. So I'm just going to go ahead and assume that those core 4 of Quickly, RJ, Scottie, and Jakob are going to be 4 of the 5 starters. Now, the good news, and if you look at some of last year's lineup data, those 4 guys actually did pretty decently together when they had those 4 players on the floor. And of course, they changed up who the 5th guy was. A lot of it was Gary Trent Jr., a lot of it was other players and stuff like that. But those 4 of Quickly, RJ, Yak, and Scottie, they played 234 minutes last season together as a lineup. They posted an offensive rating of 119.4, which is pretty good. Like it's like, top 10 ish. And then defensive rating was actually surprisingly strong at 108.6. That put them at a net rating of plus 10.8, just as a 4-man group. So I think first and foremost, like the biggest number to take away from there is just the fact that they only play 234 minutes together. I think that what that reflects is that there were a lot of trades that took place last season. And then shortly after those trades, there were a lot of injuries that compounded and took players out of the lineup. So we're really looking at, in terms of those 234 minutes, that is a window that took place in January after IQ and RJ joined the team. And then, of course, after Pascal got traded off the team, because, of course, he was starting too. Those 4 guys actually did decently in that time. And I think the question for this season, especially with the starting lineup, is just who is that 5th guy going to be? Now, the other part that Darko talked about was it might be a variable. There might be guys coming in and out of the lineup. Certainly last season, we've seen a lot of different starting lineups last season, but that was more due to the fact that last season was so, tumultuous and they had a lot of trades and injuries and et cetera, et cetera. I think this year we might see various guys come in and out of that 5th spot. And I want to look at some of those candidates. So The first candidate I thought of, and I think this probably, if I had to bet my money on this, I'd probably go with Gradey. Um, Gradey, I think, as the fifth starter, the pros are fairly obvious. I think what they would like from the fifth starter spot, first and foremost, is shooting, because you have quickly, but you also have RJ and Scotty. Those guys are going to be driving the ball. Those guys are going to be, needing space to operate. And of course, Jakob is creating the space with his screening and then rolling. That's a different form of spacing that he's creating. But realistically, a lot of these guys need spacing around them just to be able to attack, just to be able to sort of, keep the defense honest. And honestly, if the help rotates off those guys, somebody to kick it out to. I think those are all, in terms of those four players, plus passer at their position, which is kind of nice. So realistically, though, what you're looking for is a guy who doesn't have the ball all that much, at least offensively, and then B, can really do a good job spacing the floor. Out of all the guys on the team, Grady's probably the best option at this. And just to draw a little bit of an analogy, right? Because if you look at last year's data once again, the guy who probably functionally, in terms of this fifth starter, who would play in this sort of like spacing role, the guy most similar to that last season was Gary Trent Jr., who obviously has moved on to the Milwaukee Bucks, and hopefully he's okay. It seemed like he hurt his arm like in the first game of preseason, but Gary was sort of that fifth guy who would space the floor. Now Gary did a little bit more shot creation of its own as well. We know he had a mid range game. Obviously he was shoot first, pass second kind of guy, but still, like, functionally gave that role. And I think, just to make that comparison, those core four last season, when they had Gary as the fifth guy, played 164 minutes together. The offensive rating was pretty good, 119.4, and the defensive rating was 109.2, which put them at a net rating of about plus 10. So I think that idea of those four guys plus a shooter actually did work a decent amount last season. Of course, that's very, very small. 164 minutes is like how many, Nick Nurse would play at his Fred VanVleet in a week, basically, right? So, like, you got to take that for granted, or with a grain of salt. But at the same time, I think there's a case for Grady that could make it work offensively. Defensively, that's where I have my concerns about that idea, because on the flip side, there is a defensive weakness in the starting five that needs to be addressed. Whether you're talking about, if you're going, for example, with Grady as that fifth starter, that's Quickly, that's Grady, that's RJ. Those three guys, you know, have to do a lot of the bulk of the effort guarding the ball, at least, right? Most teams are still, despite, positionless basketball and all that kind of stuff, most teams are still coming at you with their guards. Most teams are still starting their offense off with their guards, playing in pick and roll and stuff like that. And as much as it's nice to have a really defensively solid center in Jakob Poeltl, protecting them in the back line, and then of course a Scottie Barnes who can really come over and be a help side defender, and he was very good in that role last season, you still would ideally want better on-ball defenders in your starting lineup, especially versus than Quickly, Grady, and RJ. Now, RJ, I think, has been improving on that front, and that's something that they've really sort of put as a challenge to RJ this season, is to approach defense with the same enthusiasm as he approaches offense. Because I think it's pretty clear that RJ is a very effective offensive player, especially going to the basket. So, and we did see better defense from RJ in the Olympics with Team Canada. So I'm going to assume that RJ will continue to be solid defensively. And let's say that's not a worry. For me, though, I'm still worried, because when you're going up against teams in the Eastern Conference, or even just in the league as a whole, you'll probably see like the first couple of games, right? First game is Cleveland. So who's going to guard Donovan Mitchell, for example? It's going to be one of Quickly or Grady. That's probably not going to go well, right? Then you go to, like, the Denver Nuggets are coming in after that, or like I think the Philadelphia 76ers are up. Like, who's guarding Maxey? Like, I certainly don't really trust either of those guys to really lock it down for me. And so, even though I think Grady still, for me, if you consider all the options, is the best option, there is a case to be made that they should put a defensive oriented guard to be that guy. And when you look at the Raptors roster, the guy for me is probably Ochai Agbaji. Now, of course, like, Ochai did not make a big impact last season when he joined the team post trade deadline. Him and Kelly coming over from Utah. Some of that obviously is due to all the fluctuations in the lineup, but I also thought that he just looked generally uncomfortable a lot of times. It doesn't it's not a huge positive to me that they've essentially taken the summer to reinvent his offensive game. Darko talked a lot about, getting Ochai to be better balanced on his jumpers, sort of teaching him sort of to be better off, playing without the ball. He wasn't very effective in summer league either. He had a lot of underwhelming games, which was disappointing not only because those games weren't good, but because he was a third-year player playing in summer league. You would typically expect those players to look very comfortable because they spent a lot of time, but at the same time, he still looked, raw in a lot of moments. But I think the one thing with Ochai is I trust him defensively. Ochai is probably one of the most fit players on the team, if not the most cut player on the team. I think he's got really good size at 6'4", 6'5". I think he can guard ones and twos pretty comfortably. If you want to throw him some threes, I don't even mind. I'm not talking threes like Luka or like LeBron. That size I think is a little too much. I think that's where you got to hand it off to Scottie for that. But I think that like most one, twos, and threes, you could comfortably put Ochai on the ball defensively and have him sort of take the brunt. Because again, like it's one thing to be like, well, listen, like, maybe we don't score that well, but then, or we don't defend that well, but we can sort of like win on the scoring aspect. The thing is, if you're constantly putting IQ, for example, against, let's say you're playing Philly, you're constantly making IQ guard Maxi, how much is that leaving with legs to then play offense effectively, right? Versus you put in a defensive specialist, have them sort of take the beatings for the rest of the team, and then, just go from there. I think the issue with that though, with Ochai, is just he hasn't shown enough offensively to merit being a starting level player. Now that doesn't mean that he hasn't started in his career. He has started a decent amount of games in Utah, even some in Toronto. But like you could tell that his 3-point shooting primarily is limited to the corners, and even there, he's like just getting better. I could certainly see on his scouting report guys coming out, leaving him alone, and that leaves a lot of the pressure for IQ and RJ and Scottie to create offense while the paint is sagged off of with both Jakob and Ochai. And I think the other thing too is just like, does he do enough else in the offense to sort of help supplement, right? Because we're not always talking about spacing and screening and shooting and scoring. It's also like, does he do some ball handling, which in this case he doesn't really do? And also, does he contribute as a screener and roller? They're trying to do that with him, but they're mostly doing that with the second unit. So I actually wouldn't mind seeing Darko potentially go to something more matchup dependent. And that's where maybe you would look at, let's say, for example, you're playing a team with two bigs, right? Not this year's Pelicans because they got rid of some pieces, but like let's say you run into last year's Pelicans. You got JV out there, you got Zion out there, you got Brandon Ingram out there. It makes a little bit of sense to sort of go with a bigger group if you're going to try to counteract that. In that case, I actually wouldn't mind, let's say, for example, throwing Kelly in the starting lineup once in a while. I know it sort of really changes a lot of what they want to do offensively with the second unit, but you can sort of massage the minutes to some degree to sort of manage around that. I also think that like Kelly playing by himself as the five is always going to be an issue defensively. I'll talk about that in a bit. But I do think that like that can kind of supplement a little bit in terms of if you want to get more size in the starting group. I suppose like Bruce Brown is also an option to start whenever he's able to return from his knee surgery. We'd have to see how he, performs. We have to see sort of how much the other guys are struggling. That's a backup option for me, I suppose. But for me, I would primarily look at Gradey and Ochai. And I know that neither one is perfect. Like ideally, you get the two of them to become one person, and that will be like almost a perfect 3-and-D type of player to throw into this starting five. But in general, I do think that I would love to see Grady get the first shot. And if it's really not working out defensively and it's a problem every night and it's dragging on the whole team, then I will try Ochai. And then I will go more creative than that. But that for me would be the starting five. The core four was already pretty good. Hopefully they continue that success from last season. And hopefully Grady can really, really provide something for that group as the fifth starter. We want to take this break in the podcast to let you know that we are partnering with Tangerine for this season. For people who aren't familiar, Tangerine is the official bank of the Toronto Raptors and its fans, and Tangerine is a foundational partner of NBA Canada and WNBA Canada. Tangerine is focused on growing the game of basketball in the country from the grassroots level all the way up to the pros, and where you will find a court, you will likely find Tangerine. And that's the mission that really resonated with us, because we also share the same goal of growing the game of basketball here in Canada. What you need to know about Tangerine is that they are about forward banking. That means no unfair fees, no overly complicated products, no expensive brick and mortar branches. And if you want to learn more about Tangerine, go to tangerine.ca. Now, when you move to the second unit, that to me is much more of a question mark. There isn't just like, you know, there's a lot of options that Darko wants can go with this. I think number one is how many guys do you bring off the bench? Like, what is your rotation going to look like? Of course, right now, Raptors don't even have a fully healthy group, even in preseason, with RJ going out, with Jacoby going out, with Bruce Brown going out, Emmanuel quickly missing time, Scottie Barnes missing for personal reasons, although he will play on Friday when you're listening to this. So, very excited to see sort of what his progress looks like and things like this. But um, the question is how many guys, let's say you have all of them available, do you even use, right? And I think last season you saw Darko kind of reach 10 deep to start the season, go to 9 at some points, and then as the season went on, whatever, it got super wacky. But I think generally speaking, comfortably, he's going to play between 9 and 10, especially to start the season. You probably start at 10. If it really doesn't work out, you cut to 9 and et cetera, et cetera. But assuming that he goes with 10, like a full second unit that comes off the bench, I think a couple of things. Number one, there is I think there maybe is a conversation to be had about who should be the backup point guard. I think we've all fallen in love with Jamal Shed off that first game, off of Summer League. He is a really great character. And my prediction for Jamal Shed, by the way, for this season is he is going to be the new go-to guy that a lot of reporters are going to. Because even just going to practices 2, 3 times this week, every single day after practice, there are requests for Jamal Shed, and he seems to be a really good and eloquent speaker. And so expect to see a lot of media coverage out of this because just letting you know that's just kind of how this thing goes. People who are really good at speaking end up getting requested a lot, and Jamal certainly is one of those guys. Um, but at the same time, I think that like between Jamal Shed and Davion Mitchell, I think Davion's going to get the first shot. I think number one at the backup point guard position, what I really want of that guard is first off something a little bit different from the starting guard, right? So quickly is really good offensively, really good shooter, plays pick and roll really well. They're working on him with the finishing. I saw him doing a lot of like even just mic and drill kind of stuff, and like little you start off with mic and drill, like just working on sort of layups and various finishing moves under the basket, and then he started going for more floaters and things like this. Um, but I do think that, like, yeah, a defensively oriented point guard coming off the bench, I think works a lot. Now, this point guard doesn't necessarily need to create that much offense for himself. And the reason for that is it's most likely that Kelly is going to be doing most of the playmaking for the second unit. When I asked Kelly about it, because he has been running a lot of offense in preseason and also at open practice, I asked him, like, how do you feel about the fact that you've had the ball so much for the second unit? He kind of said, like, hopefully this is sort of like the trend going into the season as well. And so if Kelly's going to have the ball a lot, what they need this point guard to be is defend his own position, maybe even help out others on defense, and then also, be solid, but also be able to play without the ball since Kelly's going to have it so much for that second unit. And I think first off, Davion fits this role really well. He's a guy who I know Darko's talked about, giving him more freedom offensively. We will see, quite frankly. It's not like I was watching Sacramento games that closely to see all of Davion and see that there's something a little bit more there than what he showcased. But at the same time, like even if he is what he is, which is a really defensively solid backup guard, I think that's okay. I think for him, he's a better 3-point shooter than Jamal Shed is right now. And he's more experienced and he has much more time in the league. There's also the other element that it's a little bit underrated, but the Raptors actually can, up until the start of the season, work out a potential extension with Davion Mitchell. And I think that I would like to see him just get a little bit more time in the system, maybe even over the course of preseason to get a better look at it. Now, when I say work on an extension, I don't think it's going to be some sort of massive extension. And quite frankly, the Raptors haven't had him long enough to really, really guarantee any sort of contract certainty. But if I had to guess, I would say like, if he were amenable to like a 2-year $15 million contract or 2-year even 20 million. I mean, the way the contracts are these days, like they're not that big. Like I think this offseason was actually rather quiet. You see a guy like Isaac Okoro, for example, I think he held out in restricted free agency and totally different scenario and all that kind of stuff. But I think he ended up around 13 a year, right? So like, yeah, you give Davion like 8, even 8, right? Like see if he'll take it. I think there's a value to sort of extending and depending on sort of how he fits with the team. But yeah, he probably for me gets the first crack. I know we all love Jamal, but I do think that as a rookie, it's going to take a little bit of time to come into the lineup. And I do think that there is the idea of potentially playing both, and we discussed that on a previous episode this week. And I guess my expanded thoughts on playing both Jamal and Davion coming off the bench is that like there might be diminishing returns. And what I mean by that is like only one of these guys can guard the ball, and their primary value is how much havoc and pressure they put on the ball. Now, of course, they can both be good off ball players and stuff like that defensively, and I'm sure they are. But the issue is, I think for me, you're just not creating enough offensively. If you're telling me two of your guards are both defensive lockdown guys, like there's very few examples of this in the league as that type of combo. Like it's I don't know. I just don't think they'll create enough offense. And as much as Kelly's going to have it at the top, that means these guys got to be really good at spacing. That means these guys got to be really good at shooting the ball. And there's this, I don't know. I just doesn't feel like they really should be bringing two small point guards off of the bench. I think like maybe as time goes on, maybe if like more and more development happens, with a guy like Davion, let's say he sharpens up his three even more. Let's say Jamal does the same thing. Maybe then you can have that conversation because like I guess we did play and start Kyle and Fred for like a whole season once upon a time, but those guys were both like, A, first off, way better than these two, and also B, like really, really good shooters and really smart players who can play off of each other. And we had premium rim protection between Marcus Gasol and Serge Ibaka, and also OG and Pascal to sort of like shield against the fact that they had two really small guards in the backcourt. I just don't think it's worth it right now. I think it's pretty clear it's IQ's one, Davion's the backup, and then Jamal's the third. But until there are tangible changes in their skill set, don't think that's going to change. So that's the backup point guard position. Kelly's going to be running a lot of offense for the second unit. He's like your four. Ideally, I don't want him to be the five. The good thing with him playing the five is that if he's being guarded by the opposing five, that neutralizes a lot of the opposing team's shot blocking because Kelly is a guy who's a credible threat to space to floor. And if he's going to handle the ball too, like there's a lot of interesting actions the Raptors can run. I do think that if I had to guess, Gradey does start. Ochai comes off the bench. And I don't mind Ochai and Kelly playing together. I think the more that they can do that, the better. Something that Kelly talked about with Ochai when I asked him about it this week was that Ochai is a very, very effective screener and he's got great athleticism. And they're really trying more and more to sort of put Ochai in this role of being off ball as a spacer in the corners, or if he's going to come near the ball, he's going to be a screener rather than a handler. He's going to be a screener and then use the athleticism to dive and roll. And, we haven't seen this aspect yet, but maybe he can develop it of picking out the right passes too if a rotation comes to him. But regardless, I think that most likely Ochai is that guy that comes off the bench, and him and Kelly have had good chemistry. I even asked Kelly about, we've seen Ochai screen for you a lot in these inverted pick and rolls. Is that something you guys did in Utah as well? And that's something apparently that, Will Hardy was doing with them too in Utah. So there's a built-in chemistry and experience there. And I think that, especially for a guy like Ochai, who's very limited offensively at the moment, it still feels like the best way to use them is with a very crafty player like Kelly who could space it out. Past that, I don't really know. I mean, I think that at certain points this season, I would love to see Jacoby Walter, be in and around the rotation, be like a ninth to 10th guy. The organization is very, very high on him, and we haven't got to see him yet because he hurt his shoulder, right before preseason. But eventually he'll be there, and I know he'll spend some time in the 905 too. But I would love to see if he could sort of crack that rotation. When you're looking at the bench right now, there's not a lot of offense. There's some defense, which is good. Offensively, it's mostly Kelly. Maybe Bruce, if he comes off the bench, he would be a little bit of offense too, but it's not like Bruce is like a creator either. I would love to see like Jacoby potentially step into that role. The other part for me that's an issue for the second unit is just like size and defense. And I think that's where there's a debate to be had between who's the other big or at least the other forward besides Kelly in the front court for the second unit. And I think it's pretty much one of Jonathan Mobo or Chris Boucher. Two very different players at the moment, even though I would say both of them are sort of being billed as hustle guys. I think that they're clearly a little bit different, though. I think Chris's hustle is very unique, and he's more impactful in terms of he creates more events, he gets more offensive rebounds, he closes out and deflects more passes and threes and stuff like that. But I do think that Mobo has the ability to first off have more upside. He's like a decade younger than Chris basically, And also, I think that there already seems to be a reading of the game in terms of the in between moments that I think Mobile is actually better at Chris than kind of already inherently. Maybe that's just because he has a background of being a point guard before he hit a growth spurt. But as much as I think Mobile has looked awkward and out of place in a half court, and I think it's a lot easier to play Chris right now because you can sort of put Chris on the perimeter as a spacer. He can catch and shoot for threes. He can crash the glass from the corners, et cetera, et cetera. Even put him in a couple pick and rolls, although realistically not really doing that so much. Um, I think Mobile I think mobile has more upside there in terms of sort of what they want to do. I think he's already certainly a better passer, a better handler of the ball. He's definitely got to improve his 3 point shooting. That's something where when we saw him airball a couple threes in open practice, like that's not an unlikely sight. I do like that he's trying those out because the Raptors are sort of pushing him in this direction in terms of development. But at the same time, I think there's the length there. I think he can, probably the same aptitude to defend with Chris. Chris is longer, but at the same time, I think Mobo is maybe a tad stronger and has a frame that feels like he can get a little bit bigger as well. But yeah, I mean, that might be circling back to the general theme of the season, which is like, are we prioritizing development or are we prioritizing winning? I think if you're just trying to win the game straight up, I'd play Chris over Mobo. I don't think it's that close between who's more immediately productive and who's a better player right now. But I do think that for their purposes, they might try to give it to Mobo too, on in the sake of development. And I do think that you know eh, it does kind of suck, you know what I mean, to think about it in those terms. But you also have to see the bigger picture in mind. And Raptors have been pretty clear about this is what their intentions are for the season, and so. That might just be something that happens. And again, I do feel bad for Chris if he gets the short end of the stick. But yeah, that's kind of how I see the second unit shaping out. Again, like you'll have Davion Mitchell, you have Kelly Olynyk, you'll have probably one of Chris or Mobo. If I had to guess, probably Mobo. And then the other guards position is probably going to be Bruce when he comes back and be healthy. So that's kind of how the Raptors rotation will shape out. Of course, we'll see lots of lineups over the course of the season, but I'm actually kind of intrigued because again, like we just haven't seen enough of it, right? Even the going back to the starting lineup and how the core four were like a net rating of plus 10.8 last season, that's still only at 234 minutes, and the season is like I don't know, in the thousands, right? So I would love to see an extended look at these guys. Hopefully they get most of their injuries and absences out the way before the year. Preseason has been a little bit annoying for that aspect. It's also annoying because there's like somehow 5 days between games. Um, but I would love to see how it comes together, and that's a storyline that I'm actually going to be tracking this season. Is just how the Raptors actually shape their rotation going forward. We're gonna take a Actually, I guess we're not gonna take a quick break. Okay, Jerome, I'm just gonna do the Betway thing near, and then I'm gonna close the pod. Um, so speaking of practice, though, and sort of the themes coming out of it this week, one thing that was interesting for me was Darko saying that one of Scottie's goals for the season is to win Defensive Player of the Year. Darko's statement was, he wants as much as possible to help Scottie in that regard. And of course, there's an overall team effort to defend better. Certainly, the Raptors need to be at least top 10 defensively for Scottie to even have a chance. But given that this is a stated goal for Scottie and something that Darko does want to encourage and help make happen, I did take a look on Betway at the odds. And of course, you can hit the QR code here for all your sports betting needs with Betway. But I did take a look at what are Scottie's odds to win Defensive Player of the Year this season. And as you would expect, they're quite long 200 to 1 odds for Scottie to win Defensive Player of the Year. And I do think that, like, it's unlikely, mostly because the team defense is not strong enough, mostly because there's some incredible defenders in the league, and that Scottie, being as good as he is, isn't isn't a top 10 defender in the league or anything. But at the same time, if there is this big jump, if there's this big growth, and honestly, even if you just want to sprinkle a little bit on this, I kind of don't mind the idea just because of the fact that this is one of those awards that's purely team additive. You can't like stat chase your way to getting defensive player of the year. You know what I mean? Like you really have to really be great, really be solid, really take on a huge responsibility. And I think for Scottie, like he's not one thing you could really tell with him is he's not shying away from the responsibility, whether that's offensive, whether it's defensively. He's accepting those challenges. And the fact that he put this on himself and that Dark was willing to help him with the defensive player of the year chase, you know, uh, who are we to say that he's not 201 odds? Certainly, you're going to get a big payout if somehow Scottie makes it to that point. But just thought that was a little interesting with Scottie. Again, I love the fact that that's a goal of his for this year. It's not the first time he's mentioned it too. I know he talked about it last year as well. But as with everything in basketball, your team has to be good too. So that does it for the podcast this week. I appreciate everyone for listening to this one. We'll be back with Alex next week once he's back from New York, and we'll get more guests. Once again, make sure you follow the Hello and Welcome podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, if you haven't done so already, make sure to drop us a review, especially in Apple Podcasts, especially in Spotify. Drop us a review and just really help continue the growth of this show, because we're really excited. This is our first Raptors season with the program going independent, and I'm really looking forward to just growing this thing as big as possible and bring as many people along for the ride. So thanks everyone for listening, and yeah, this has been the Hello and Welcome podcast presented by Betway.